Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Hey guys, welcome to another fun-filled week of history. And today we are going to begin to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. It is a conflict that, in my estimation, is the most climactic event in U.S. history, and that is the American Civil War. What we're going to be looking at this week would be the causes for this conflict. And it may not seem as though discussing the causes of the Civil War is necessary. You may be concluding already that the cause of the Civil War is what your history teachers have told you all along, and that is that slavery caused the war. And although that answer isn't inaccurate, it isn't holistically accurate either, because it doesn't bring into the conversation the multitude of causes which ultimately leads to the outbreak of the war. One of the things that has happened quite frequently, and I've even made reference to this, is that we've created this binary, this or the other kind of thinking when it comes to historical events. And we've done this with the Civil War, where we have said that the North were all abolitionists and they fought a war to end slavery, versus the South that was, all in favor of supporting slavery. So we've sort of created this binary, and the reality is that's not really true. There are multiple causes for why the Civil War erupted. And in fact, there's multiple ways to ask the question, what caused the Civil War? I'll read to you from a anthology edited by Kenneth Stamp. He's no longer with us, Causes of the Civil War. And Kenneth Stamp writes the following. He says, "One may ask what caused the Civil War in three different ways, all of them independent, but each nonetheless a slightly different question. 1. What caused the North and South to engage in ceaseless controversy for more than a generation? In other words, why did the North and the South, as a broad category geographic location, fight the war, right? Then you might ask it this way. What caused the states of the Deep South to secede after Lincoln's election? Is the answer to that question the same as the one where the North and the South are fighting each other? And then number 3, what caused the great majority of Northerners to prefer the use of force to the recognition of Southern independence? And the answers to each of these questions is varied. It's different, right? When we look at letters and diaries of Northerners who fought in the Civil War, most of them aren't speaking, or rather a lot of them don't mention slavery as the reason why they are fighting. Rather, they are fighting for God and country. They're fighting for the best constitution on the planet. We know that many Northerners weren't fighting the Civil War to end or to end slavery, because when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, enlistments actually dropped off in the Northern armies, and so much so that they had to institute a draft, which will actually result in a draft riot in 1863. Had Northerners been going to war to fight to end slavery, then the Emancipation Proclamation would have propelled additional folks to join the army, not diminished them, right? On the same token, we might ask that question, why did the South secede from the Union? Well, a lot of that has to do not necessarily with slavery. A lot of it does, but some of it also has to do with issues of states' rights and federalism, and the idea that the states should have supreme authority over the decisions that they want to make. I mean, we've seen this throughout U.S. history already in this course, where there have been tensions between North and South over issues of whether or not the federal government should be able to dictate what the states do. I think we can see this clearly in the nullification crisis that took place during Andrew Jackson's administration. And if you think back to the nullification crisis, that particular situation had nothing to do with slavery. Rather, it had to do with protective tariffs. And ultimately, South Carolina did not believe that the protective tariffs were beneficial to South Carolina, and so they threatened secession. They did not do so, but then they nullified the law, and the federal government said you can't do that. And so we see tensions here exist, not necessarily over slavery, but over issues of states' rights, okay? If we answer the question, why did the North and the South go at war with one another, that gets a little bit more complicated. Slavery becomes definitely a key component to that. But there are other issues going on as well. right? I mean, if we were to ask Abraham Lincoln why he continued to have the North fight the war, his answer would have been to preserve the Union. One of the things that we have habitually told students is that Lincoln was the great emancipator. Lincoln went to the Civil War, fought the war in order to free slaves, evidenced by the Emancipation Proclamation. And the reality is he did not go to war, at least initially, to fight to free the slaves. He made that point very clear. He said time and time again, if I can preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, then I'll do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, then I'll do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing some and keeping others in bondage, then I'll do that. His objective was not to free the slaves. His objective was to preserve the Union. And even when we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, you'll see that the proclamation was not necessarily issued out of moral indignation against slavery, but rather as a war measure in order to get the Union pulled back together. So all that is simply to make very clear and plain to you that if you start this lecture off, or if you start this week off with the perception that slavery was the cause, you're not necessarily wrong. But there are multiple layers to this. I mean, if it was just slavery, and that's what we could conclude on, then historians wouldn't have to have spilled much ink trying to figure it out. But they have spilled a lot of ink in attempting to figure out what caused the war. So what I want to do is just sort of provide for you an overview of what some of the key causes for the war were. Now, there are, in my mind, the way I think about it, we have these causes, right? And they are up here. But then we have what I call these trigger events. And we will be looking at a number of trigger events that bring pressure to a boiling point, to the point where ultimately we're going to break out in war. Now, there are multiple causes for the war, but we're going to talk about 4 this week. I'm not going to go into too much detail on those here because we've got discussions of them later on. But they would include things like slavery. Slavery definitely would be a cause. We have the westward expansion of slavery. One might refer to this as manifest destiny. The fact that as slavery expanded across the American hemisphere, it ultimately made sectional differences untenable. They could not hold together. As some folks thought that slavery was expanding too much across the Western plains, this creates problems. And of course, on the other side, as Southerners believe that Northerners are attempting to end slavery, that also creates problems. So we have slavery, we have the westward expansion of slavery, we have states' rights, and again, there have been multiple arguments made about states' rights. We've seen some of these already. Some folks have argued that new states that entered into the Union should not be told what to do by the federal government, that new states that enter the Union should have the same right of action or the same right of action as the original 13 colonies. In other words, no one told Virginia when it became a state if they could have slaves or not. So therefore, nobody should be able to tell Kansas. Nobody should be able to tell Louisiana or, Missouri or whatever. Okay? And so you definitely have an issue of states' rights going on. There's also economic differences. Economic differences by every imagination you can see may very well have helped to cause this war. You can see that you have an industrializing North versus an agrarian South. Now, that stated, I did make clear that those two economies definitely were connected to one another, but they are moving along separate lines. And then finally, we have preservation of the Union. And the extent to which preservation of the Union was a cause for everybody, we can debate that, but we definitely can say that was Lincoln's cause. And as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, as the President of the United States, this is a key cause that we have to think about. And so we're going to go through each of these this week. And actually, for some of you in the following week, I've got 2 classes looking at this content at the same time. And some of you are doing all this in 1 week, some of you are doing it in 2. So just be aware. But we're going to go through this content, and my objective for this week is to get you to think about the ways in which each of these causes may have brought about the war. I don't want you to dismiss any particular one of them because you've already potentially made up your mind. I think that's one of the dangers with history is we oftentimes want to boil it down to that binary, and then we get stuck in that binary. And so look at these things as you go through the interactive activity. Again, some of you are going to do that this week, some of you are going to do that next week. As you go through that interactive activity, as you go through the videos, as you go through your reading, try to think about how each of those particular causes may have contributed to the outbreak of the war. Okay. Now, in addition to looking at these 4 broad causes, I'm also going to have us take a look at a number of trigger events. And this is the way that this would work. If we were to take a look at like the nullification crisis, having already brought that up, we could argue that the nullification crisis was a cause of the war. But in my mind, I think it's better to think of the nullification crisis as a trigger event. Because if we asked, why did the nullification crisis become a crisis, we could then say, well, let's take a look at our 4 major causes. The nullification crisis would be connected back to issues of states' rights, right? We could also see that there was an issue of preserving the Union because South Carolina had threatened secession. Andrew Jackson said that wouldn't happen. And in some ways, you definitely see economic differences going on here because what you have is a protective tariff, which is benefiting the northern economy, hurting the Southerners and their economy. At least that was their perception. And so what I want you to do as you go through each of these trigger events is to sort of just think through how do they connect back to these larger causes of the war. And in the end, I'm going to have you not only identify what these causes are and describe some of the trigger events, but ultimately make a final decision as to what you think the major cause or causes were for the Civil War based upon the information presented to you, again, either in this 1 week or for some of you in 2 weeks broken apart. So I hope that that is helpful. I could go on and on and on about the causes of the Civil War, but I don't want to be so redundant here in this lecture that I basically tell you everything that's coming up. So if you have questions or comments or anything of that nature, please contact me and I'll get back in touch with you just as soon as I can. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper. May the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.